The autumn rain pelted against the tall windows of the Old Bailey, London's most famous criminal court. Inside courtroom number 1, the most serious cases in England were decided, and today was no different. The gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and family members, all waiting for the trial of Regina versus Blackwood to continue. At the back of the courtroom, standing perfectly motionless in his red tunic and bearskin hat, was Lance, Corporal William Hayes of the Queen's Guard. At 28 years old, William had been assigned to ceremonial duties for 2 years. But his background was far more complex than his silent presence suggested. Before joining the Household Division, he had spent 4 years studying law at Cambridge University, graduating with first-class honors before enlisting in the British Army. The defendant, Charles Blackwood, was accused of embezzling £2 million from a military charity. The case had captured public attention not only because of the amount stolen, but because Blackwood had been a decorated Army colonel who had used his reputation to gain trust before systematically looting funds meant for wounded veterans. Judge Patricia Thornfield, a stern woman in her 60s with 30 years on the bench, was known for her sharp intellect and no-nonsense approach to justice. She had handled some of the most complex cases in British legal history, and her knowledge of criminal law was considered encyclopedic by her peers. William stood at attention, his role purely ceremonial. Royal Guards were sometimes assigned to high-profile trials as a symbol of the Crown's interest in justice being served. He was not there to participate, not to speak, not to interfere. He was simply a living reminder of the monarchy's presence in the judicial system. The prosecution was led by Sir Marcus Bellingham QC, one of London's most respected barristers. His opening arguments had been devastating, painting Blackwood as a man who had betrayed not only the law, but the very soldiers he had once commanded. The evidence seemed overwhelming: forged documents, hidden bank accounts, and a paper trail that clearly showed systematic theft over 3 years. Blackwood's defense was handled by Victoria Sterling, a younger barrister known for her aggressive tactics and willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. She had built her reputation on finding technical loopholes and procedural errors that could overturn seemingly solid cases. As the morning session began, Sir Marcus presented what appeared to be conclusive evidence: a series of bank transfers that showed money being moved from the charity's accounts to offshore holdings controlled by Blackwood. The transactions were documented, verified, and seemed to leave no room for doubt. "Your Honor," Sir Marcus announced, "the Crown presents Exhibit A 47. Bank records showing the defendant's systematic embezzlement of charity funds between January 2019 and March 2022. Judge Thornfield examined the documents carefully. The courtroom was silent except for the scratching of court reporters' pens and the occasional whisper between legal teams. William remained motionless, but his trained legal mind was automatically analyzing the proceedings. "These records appear comprehensive," Judge Thornfield said. "I assume the defense has had adequate time to review them." Victoria Sterling rose from her seat. "Yes, Your Honor. Though we maintain these transfers were authorized under the emergency relief provisions of the Military Charities Act." William's eyes flickered almost imperceptibly. The Military Charities Act was a piece of legislation he had studied extensively during his time at Cambridge, particularly its emergency provisions. Something about Sterling's reference didn't sound correct. Judge Thornfield nodded. "Very well. However, as I understand the emergency relief provisions, they require board approval for any single transaction exceeding £50,000. The documents before me show multiple transactions well above that threshold with no evidence of proper authorization." William's jaw tightened slightly. The judge's interpretation was wrong. The emergency relief provisions had been amended in raising the threshold to £200,000 and allowing expedited approval processes during declared emergency periods. The COVID-19 pandemic had triggered those provisions, making many of Blackwood's transactions potentially legal. Sir Marcus smiled with satisfaction. "Precisely, Your Honor. The defendant clearly acted outside his authority, but William knew this. Interpretation could lead to a wrongful conviction. If Blackwood had indeed operated under the amended emergency provisions, the prosecution's entire case would collapse. The transactions might have been legally authorized even if they were ultimately misused. Victoria Sterling seemed unaware of the error. Her defense strategy appeared to focus on character witnesses and procedural challenges rather than the specific legal framework governing charitable transactions during emergency periods. She was missing a potentially case-changing technicality. The morning continued with witness testimony from charity board members, who confirmed they had not explicitly approved the large transactions. Each witness strengthened the prosecution's case, while Judge Thornfield's incorrect interpretation of the law went unchallenged. During the lunch recess, William remained at his post while the courtroom emptied. Legal teams huddled in corridor conferences. Journalists filed their morning reports, and the judge retired to her chambers. The silent guard was alone with his troubling knowledge. William faced an unprecedented dilemma: possessed information that could fundamentally alter the trial's outcome, but his role forbade him from speaking. Royal guards were expected to be seen but not heard, symbols rather than participants. Breaking that tradition would not only end his career, but could potentially cause a constitutional crisis about military interference in civilian justice. Yet his legal training told him that justice required accurate application of the law. If the judge's misunderstanding led to a wrongful conviction, it would be a miscarriage of justice, regardless of Blackwood's ultimate guilt or innocence. The law was the law, and it had to be applied correctly. When the afternoon session resumed, the prosecution called its final witness, the charity's chief financial officer, who testified about the irregularities in the accounts. Her testimony was compelling and seemed to seal Blackwood's fate. Judge Thornfield prepared to give her preliminary ruling on the admissibility of the bank transfer evidence. Based on my understanding of the Military Charities Act, specifically the emergency relief provisions requiring board approval for transactions exceeding £50,000, I find that the defendant clearly operated outside legal authority. The evidence will be admitted in full. William's training ward with his duty. Every instinct developed during 4 years of legal education screamed that this was wrong. The judge's ruling would make Blackwood's conviction nearly certain, but it would be based on an incorrect interpretation of the law. In that moment, Lance Corporal William Hayes made a decision that would change his life forever. For the first time in 2 years of ceremonial duty, he broke his statue-like silence. "Your Honor," William's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade through silence, "I believe there may be an error in your interpretation of the emergency relief provisions." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the back wall where the new-formed guards stood. Journalists fumbled for their notebooks, lawyers froze mid-motion, and court staff stared in disbelief. In the centuries-old tradition of British justice, ceremonial guard had never spoken during proceedings. Judge Thornfield's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, and then stern disapproval. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying dangerous authority. "Did a member of the Queen's Guard just interrupt my courtroom?" William stepped forward slightly, maintaining his military bearing despite the magnitude of what he was doing. "Yes, Your Honor, Lance Corporal William Hayes, Household Division. I apologize for the interruption, but I believe there's a significant legal error that could affect the outcome of this trial." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Sir Marcus Bellingham looked as if he had been struck by lightning. Victoria Sterling stared at William with a mixture of confusion and dawning hope. Court reporters frantically scribbled notes, trying to capture this unprecedented moment. "Corporal Hayes," Judge Thornfield's voice was ice-cold, "you are completely out of order. Your role in this courtroom is ceremonial. I have no standing to address the court, no legal training to interpret statute, and no authority to question judicial decisions." William felt every eye in the room upon him. His military career was effectively over the moment he had spoken, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to remain silent while justice was potentially perverted by legal error. "Your Honor, with respect, I do have legal training. Graduated from Cambridge with first-class honors in jurisprudence before enlisting. I'm familiar with the Military Charities Act and its amendments, particularly the 2020 modifications to the emergency relief provisions. Judge Thornfield's expression shifted from anger to bewilderment. A Cambridge law graduate serving as a ceremonial guard was unusual enough, but one willing to risk everything to correct a legal interpretation was unprecedented. Sir Marcus rose from his seat. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Prosecution objects to any intervention from non-parties to the case, regardless of their claimed qualifications. Victoria Sterling, however, was quickly grasping the implications. Your Honor, if there is indeed a question about the legal framework governing this case, surely it's in the interest of justice to hear all relevant information. The judge stared at William for a long moment, weighing centuries of courtroom tradition against the possibility that her interpretation of the law was incorrect. The tension in the room was palpable. Corporal Hayes, she said finally, you have placed this court in an extremely difficult position. Your intervention is unprecedented and potentially prejudicial. However, if you genuinely believe there is a material error in my legal interpretation, I am obligated to hear your concern, though. I warn you that the consequences for you personally will be severe regardless of the merit of your claim. William nodded gravely. I understand, Your Honor. Very well. State your objection to my interpretation of the emergency relief provisions. William took a deep breath, drawing on 4 years of legal training and countless hours spent studying charitable law, Your Honor. You stated that the emergency relief provisions require board approval for transactions exceeding £50,000. That was indeed the original threshold when the Act was passed in 2018. However, the Act was significantly amended in March 2020 through the emergency powers COVID-19 legislation. He paused, allowing the courtroom to absorb this information. Judge Thornfield's expression had shifted from anger to careful attention. The 2020 amendments raised the threshold to £200,000 and created an expedited approval process for declared emergency periods. More importantly, they granted chief executives of qualifying charities temporary expanded authority during government-declared emergencies. Sir Marcus was furiously consulting with his junior barristers, clearly caught off guard by this development. Victoria Sterling was taking rapid notes, her earlier confusion replaced by sharp focus. Judge Thornfield frowned. Are you suggesting that the COVID-19 pandemic triggered these emergency provisions? Yes, Your Honor. The government declared a national emergency in March 2020, which automatically activated the expedited provisions of the Military Charities Act. During this period, which extended through December 2021, chief executives of military charities were granted expanded authority to approve transactions up to £200,000 without formal board votes, provided they documented the emergency justification. The implication was staggering. If William was correct, many of the transactions that formed the basis of the prosecution's case might have been legally authorized, even if they were ultimately misappropriated. Victoria Sterling stood up. Your Honor, if I may, this interpretation would require a complete review of the evidence against my client. You would need to examine whether the transactions occurred during the emergency period and whether proper documentation was filed. Judge. Thornfield looked deeply troubled. Corporal Hayes, are you certain of these amendments? This is a very serious claim. William nodded. Absolutely certain, Your Honor. The amendments were passed as part of the Emergency Powers Act 2020, specifically Section 47, subsection C, paragraphs 3 through 7. The legislation is publicly available through Parliament's official records. The judge turned to her clerk. Please retrieve a copy of the Emergency Powers Act 2020 immediately. Corporal Hayes, assuming your interpretation is correct, what would be the practical effect on this case? Your Honor, it would mean that transactions occurring between March 2020 and December 2021 that were under £200,000 would be presumptively legal if proper emergency documentation was filed. Transactions over that amount would still require board approval. The prosecution would need to prove not only that the funds were misappropriated, but that the defendant acted outside his expanded emergency authority, Sir Marcus finally found. His voice, Your Honor. Even if these provisions exist, there's no evidence that proper emergency documentation was filed. The defendant cannot simply claim emergency authority retroactively. William hesitated, then pressed forward. Actually, sir, The burden of proof for emergency documentation is different under the amended Act. During declared emergency periods, the presumption is that qualified. Executives acted within their authority unless the prosecution can prove they didn't file proper documentation. The courtroom buzzed with conversation as the legal implications became clear. If William's interpretation was correct, the prosecution's case had just become much more difficult to prove. Judge Thornfield called for a brief recess, while the clerk retrieved the relevant legislation. As the courtroom slowly emptied, William remained at his post, knowing that his life had irrevocably changed. He had chosen legal accuracy over military protocol, justice over career advancement. During the recess, Victoria Sterling approached him cautiously. "Corporal Hayes, I must ask, why did you speak up? You had to know this would end your military career." William met her gaze steadily. "Because the law is the law, ma'am. Doesn't matter if the defendant is guilty of other things. If he's being convicted based on an incorrect legal interpretation, that's not justice. That's just vengeance with official approval." When court resumed, the clerk handed Judge Thornfield a copy of the Emergency Powers Act 2020. The judge spent several minutes reading the relevant sections, her expression growing more grave with each paragraph. Finally, she looked up at the packed courtroom. It appears that Corporal Hayes's interpretation of the law is ... accurate. The silence that followed Judge Thornfield's admission stretched like a held breath. In the packed courtroom, the weight of what had just occurred was settling over everyone present. A ceremonial guard had corrected one of Britain's most experienced judges on a point of law, and he had been right. Judge Thornfield set down the Emergency Powers Act and looked directly at William. "Corporal Hayes, your interpretation appears to be legally sound. The 2020 amendments did indeed modify the emergency relief provisions as you described." She paused, clearly struggling with the unprecedented situation. "However, your method of bringing this to the court's attention was highly irregular and raises serious questions about courtroom protocol." Sir Marcus Bellingham rose, his earlier confidence shaken. "Your Honor, regardless of the legal technicality, the prosecution maintains that the defendant systematically defrauded a military charity. The spirit of the law was clearly violated, even if technical emergency provisions might provide cover. For some transactions..." Victoria Sterling was quick to respond. "Your Honor, the law is not about spirit, it's about precise application of statutory requirements. If my client operated within legal authority, as the amended act suggests he may have, then the prosecution's case fundamentally changes." William watched the legal maneuvering with the trained eye of someone who understood both sides. His intervention had opened a door, but the outcome was far from certain. Blackwood might have acted within emergency provisions for some transactions, while still committing fraud in others. Judge Thornfield called for a 2-hour adjournment to allow both sides to review the implications of the amended legislation. As the courtroom cleared, William found himself surrounded by a crowd of journalists, court officials, and curious onlookers. "Corporal Hayes," called Rebecca Morrison from the Times. "Can you comment on your decision to speak up?" William maintained, his military bearing. "I have no comment beyond what was said in court. Surely you realize this will end your military career," pressed another journalist. Before William could respond, a familiar voice cut through the crowd. "That's enough. Questions for now." Colonel David Hartwell, William's commanding officer from Wellington Barracks, approached with measured steps. His expression was unreadable, but William knew he was in serious trouble. Breaking protocol in such a public manner would have consequences that extended far beyond his personal career. "Corporal Hayes," Colonel Hartwell said formally, "you will come with me immediately." William followed his commanding officer through the crowd, aware that cameras were recording every step. Outside the Old Bailey, Colonel Hartwell stopped at his official car. "Get in," he said simply. They drove in silence through London traffic for several minutes before Colonel Hartwell finally spoke. "William, in 25 years of military service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this. You understand what you've done?" "Yes, sir." "I've violated military protocol by speaking during a ceremonial assignment." "You've done far more than that," Hartwell said grimly. You've created an international incident. Stories already on every news channel. Royal Guard corrects judge is trending on social media. The palace press office is fielding calls. From around the world, William stared out the window at the familiar streets of London. He had walked these same paths in his red tunic countless times, a silent symbol of tradition and duty. Now he had broken that silence in the most public way possible. Sir, I understand the consequences, but I couldn't remain silent while justice was potentially miscarried. Colonel Hartwell glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Justice William, you're a lance corporal in the ceremonial guard. It's not your job to ensure justice. It's your job to stand quietly and look impressive. With respect, sir, I took an oath to serve Queen and country. Sometimes serving your country means more than just following orders. They arrived at Wellington Barracks, where William was escorted to Colonel Hartwell's office. The colonel closed the door and gestured for William to sit. William, I've been reviewing your file since I got the call from the Old Bailey. Cambridge law degree, first-class honors, offers from 3 major London law firms that you turned down to join the army. Why? William had been asked this question many times during his enlistment process. Sir, I wanted to serve something larger than myself. The law is important, but protecting the country that makes law possible seemed more important. And now you've used your legal knowledge to potentially overturn a major criminal case? The irony isn't lost on me. Colonel Hartwell opened a folder on his desk. I've been in contact with the Ministry of Defense, the Palace, and the Judge Advocate General's office. Your actions today have created a constitutional question that hasn't been addressed in centuries. What happens when military personnel have specialized knowledge that affects civilian judicial proceedings? William waited, knowing his fate was being decided by forces far above his pay grade. There will be a formal inquiry, Hartwell continued. Your breach of protocol cannot be ignored. However, ... He paused meaningfully. There are people in very high places who are asking whether your intervention served the greater cause of justice. Meanwhile, back at the Old Bailey, the afternoon session was drawing to a close with both legal teams scrambling to reassess their positions. Victoria Sterling had spent the recess buried in statute books, tracing the implications of the Emergency Powers Act amendments. She discovered that William had been conservative in his interpretation. The emergency provisions were even more expansive than he had suggested, potentially covering nearly all of Blackwood's disputed transactions during the COVID-19 period. Sir Marcus, meanwhile, was facing the prospect of his seemingly airtight case unraveling due to a legal technicality pointed out by a ceremonial guard. The prosecution team was working frantically to identify which charges could survive. Under the amended legal framework, when court resumed, Judge Thornfield addressed the packed gallery. Ladies and gentlemen, today's proceedings have raised unprecedented questions about courtroom protocol and legal interpretation. However, the court's primary obligation is to ensure that justice is served under the law as it actually exists, not as we might assume it to be. She turned to the legal teams. I am ordering a complete review of all charges against the defendant in light of the emergency powers. Act amendments brought to our attention by Corporal Hayes. The prosecution will have 1 week to reassess their case under the correct legal framework. Victoria Sterling stood, Your Honor, given the fundamental change in legal interpretation. The defense requests that all charges be dismissed pending proper legal review. Denied, Judge Thornfield said. Firmly, however, I am releasing the defendant on bail, pending the prosecution's review. This court will reconvene in 1 week to determine how to proceed. As the session ended, Judge Thornfield made an unprecedented gesture. She looked toward the back of the courtroom where William had resumed his ceremonial position. Corporal Hayes, she said formally, while your method was highly irregular, your legal analysis was accurate and may have prevented a miscarriage of justice. The court acknowledges your intervention, though it cannot endorse the manner in which it was delivered. Outside the courthouse, the media frenzy had intensified. News vans lined the street, and reporters thrust microphones at anyone connected to the case. The story had captured public imagination in a way that surprised everyone involved. Charles Blackwood, released on bail, found himself in the unusual position of owing his freedom to a soldier he had never met. As he walked down the courthouse steps, he paused near where William stood at attention. "Thank you," Blackwood said quietly. Knowing the guard couldn't respond, but hoping the message was received, William's eyes flickered. Almost imperceptibly, the slightest acknowledgement of a man whose fate had been altered by a moment of conscience. The following morning, William woke to find his face on the front page of every major British newspaper. The headlines varied, but the story was consistent. Guard breaks silence to correct judge. Royal Guard's legal bombshell and win ceremony. Met justice. His quiet life as an anonymous ceremonial soldier was over forever. At Wellington Barracks, Colonel Hartwell briefed him on the situation. "William, the media attention has reached unprecedented levels. The palace has received formal inquiries from Parliament, the Law Society, and constitutional scholars from around the world. Your 5-minute intervention has created a legal and constitutional crisis." William sat rigidly at attention. "Sir, I understand the gravity of the situation." "I'm not sure you do," Hartwell replied. "The Lord Chancellor has asked for a formal review of military personnel involvement in civilian courts. The Attorney General wants to interview you personally. And the Queen's private secretary has requested a briefing on how one of Her Majesty's guards came to possess detailed knowledge of emergency legislation." The implications were staggering. William's moment of conscience had raised questions that went to the heart of British constitutional law. What was the proper role of military personnel in civilian justice? When did duty to law override duty to protocol? How should specialized knowledge be handled when it might affect legal proceedings? "There's something else," Colonel Hartwell continued. "The prosecution team from the Blackwood case has formally requested your assistance in reviewing their remaining charges under the amended legal framework. They want you to serve as a legal consultant." William looked up in surprise. "Sir, it seems your intervention has convinced them that your legal analysis might be valuable in ensuring they proceed correctly. Of course, this would require your temporary detachment from ceremonial duties." Before William could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Colonel Hartwell's aide entered with a message. "Sir, there's a delegation here to see Corporal Hayes, the Law Society, Parliamentary Legal Committee, and representatives from Cambridge University." The meeting that followed was unlike anything William had experienced. Professor Margaret Ashworth, from Cambridge Law School, whom he recognized from his undergraduate studies, led a discussion about the constitutional implications of his courtroom intervention. "William," she said, using his first name, despite the formal military setting, "your action yesterday has opened a Pandora's box of legal and constitutional questions. But it's also demonstrated something important about the intersection of specialized knowledge and civic duty." Sir Richard Pemberton from the Parliamentary Legal Committee leaned forward. "Corporal Hayes, can you walk us through your thought process when you decided to speak?" William chose his words carefully. "Sir, I was trained at Cambridge to believe that the law must be applied accurately, regardless of other considerations. When I heard what I believed to be an incorrect legal interpretation that could result in wrongful conviction, my conscience wouldn't allow me to remain silent." "Even knowing it would end your military career?" asked Dame Elizabeth Foster from the Law Society. "Yes, ma'am. Some things are more important than career advancement." The delegation exchanged meaningful glances. Professor Ashworth spoke again. "William, we're here because your case has highlighted a gap in our legal system. We have highly trained legal minds serving in various capacities throughout government and military who possess knowledge that could be relevant to court proceedings, but no framework for utilizing that knowledge appropriately." Sir Richard nodded. "The Parliamentary Committee is considering legislation that would create a formal mechanism for expert knowledge to be brought before courts when justice might otherwise be compromised. Your case would be the precedent." Meanwhile, across London, at the Old Bailey, Sir Marcus Bellingham was experiencing the most challenging week of his legal career. With his prosecution team, he was systematically reviewing every charge against Charles Blackwood under the correct interpretation of the Emergency Powers Act. The results were devastating to his case. Nearly 60% of the transactions that formed the backbone of his fraud charges had occurred during the emergency period and fell below the amended threshold requiring board approval. If Blackwood had filed proper emergency documentation, and the legal presumption was that he had, unless proven otherwise, those transactions would be presumptively legal. Sir Marcus's junior barrister, James Crawford, looked up from a pile of documents. I've reviewed the emergency filing requirements. They're surprisingly minimal, basically a signed statement that the expenditure was necessary for charity operations during the declared emergency. Sir Marcus rubbed his temples. Our ability to prove such documentation wasn't filed. Limited. The charity's records were damaged in a fire 6 months ago. We have backup financial records, but not the emergency justification paperwork. The prosecution was facing a legal reality that William's intervention had forced them to confront. Without the incorrect legal framework Judge Thornfield had initially applied, their case was much weaker than they had realized. That afternoon, Victoria Sterling received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Charles Blackwood sat across from her. No longer the confident man who had entered the trial expecting vindication or the broken figure, who had watched his reputation crumble under prosecutorial assault. Miss Sterling, he began carefully, I need to tell you something that might change your defense strategy. Victoria set down her pen. I'm listening. The guard who spoke up. Corporal Hayes, he was right about the emergency provisions. But there's something else. I did file emergency documentation for most of those transactions. I followed the law exactly as it was written. Victoria felt a chill of possibility. Where is this documentation? That's the problem. It was in the charity offices when they burned. I have copies at home, but I was afraid to mention them because I thought it would look like I was manufacturing evidence after the fact. Charles, if you have documented proof that you followed proper emergency procedures, this changes everything. Why didn't you tell me this earlier? Blackwood looked out the window at the London skyline. Because I was guilty of other things. Not fraud. I never stole money for personal gain. But I was ... careless with charity funds. I made investments that lost money. I approved expenditures that weren't wise. When the prosecution painted me as a thief, part of me felt I deserved punishment for my failures, even if they weren't criminal. Victoria stared at him. You telling me that you're innocent of the charges, but guilty of poor management decisions? That's exactly what I'm telling you. And if that guard hadn't spoken up, I would have been convicted of crimes I didn't commit, while the real issue, my incompetence as a financial manager, would have been ignored. The revelation added another layer of complexity to William's intervention. He had not only corrected a legal interpretation, but potentially prevented the conviction of an innocent man while exposing the real issues that needed to be addressed. Back at Wellington Barracks, William received word that he was to report to Buckingham Palace for a private meeting. The summons came through channels so elevated that Colonel Hartwell admitted he didn't know what to expect. William Hartwell said as they prepared to leave, You're about to meet with people who make decisions that affect the entire Commonwealth. Whatever happens, remember that you acted from conscience and legal training, not from any desire for personal advancement. The drive to Buckingham Palace took William through streets where he had stood guard countless times. The familiar landmarks looked different now, viewed from inside an official car rather than from behind a ceremonial post. He wondered if he would ever wear the red tunic again. At the palace, William was escorted through corridors he had never seen during his ceremonial duties. The private offices were elegant but businesslike, suggesting that real work happened. Behind the public facade of royal ceremony, Sir James Whitmore, the Queen's private secretary, received him in a wood-paneled office overlooking the palace gardens. The man was younger than William had expected, perhaps 50, with sharp eyes that suggested both intelligence and discretion. Corporal Hayes, Sir James began without preamble, your actions yesterday have created ripples that extend far beyond a single criminal case. I've been asked to understand your motivations and assess the broader implications of what you've done. William remained at attention. Sir, I acted according to my conscience and my legal training. Yes. I've read your file. Cambridge, first-class honors, offers from prestigious law firms that you declined to serve your country. Admirable, if unusual. Sir James paused. Tell me, do you regret your decision to speak in court? The question went to the heart of everything. William had been questioning about himself. "No, sir. I believe justice requires accurate application of the law, regardless of personal consequences." Sir James smiled slightly. "Her Majesty will be interested to hear that perspective." The meeting with Sir James Whitmore lasted 2 hours, covering everything from William's background to the constitutional implications of his courtroom intervention. When it concluded, William was told to wait in an adjoining room while Sir James made several phone calls. Through the window, William could see the palace gardens where tourists gathered daily to watch the changing of the guard. He had participated in that ceremony countless times, part of a tradition stretching back centuries. Now he wondered if his actions had damaged that tradition or somehow honored its deeper meaning. When Sir James returned, "Corporal Hayes, I've spoken with Her Majesty's legal advisors, the Attorney General, and the Lord Chancellor. The consensus is that your intervention, while unprecedented, served the cause of justice in a way that reflects well on both your personal character and the military's commitment to upholding the law." William felt a wave of relief, though he tried not to show it. However, Sir James continued, "Your future role requires careful consideration. You cannot simply return to ceremonial duties as if nothing has happened. The media attention alone would be disruptive, and your legal knowledge makes you potentially valuable in other capacities." Before William could ask what that meant, Sir James handed him an official-looking document. "Her Majesty has approved your temporary assignment to the Attorney General's office as a military legal liaison. You'll work with civilian prosecutors to ensure proper application of military-related legislation in criminal cases." William stared at the document. "Sir, I'm not qualified for such a position. I'm a lance corporal with an undergraduate law degree." "You're a lance corporal who prevented a potential miscarriage of justice by applying specialized legal knowledge under extraordinary pressure. That's exactly the qualification we need." The following week, William found himself in an entirely different world. Instead of standing motionless in a red tunic, he wore civilian clothes and worked in the Attorney General's chambers near Parliament. His role was to review cases involving military personnel, veterans, or military-related legislation to ensure prosecutors understood the complex legal frameworks involved. His first case was a review of the remaining charges against Charles Blackwood. With Victoria Sterling's revelation about the emergency documentation, the prosecution's position had become untenable. William's analysis confirmed that most of the contested transactions were legally authorized under the amended emergency provisions. Sir Marcus Bellingham, who had initially opposed William's intervention, now found himself working closely with the man who had undermined his case. Their first meeting was awkward but professional. "Corporal Hayes," Sir Marcus began, "I won't pretend I was pleased when you disrupted my prosecution. But I've come to understand that your intervention prevented me from securing a conviction based on incorrect legal interpretation. That would have been a far greater injustice than temporary embarrassment." William appreciated the prosecutor's professionalism. "Sir, my intention was never to undermine your case, only to ensure the law was applied correctly." "Indeed. And now I have a question for you. Given your analysis of the emergency provisions, what do you think actually happened with Blackwood?" William had been studying the case files extensively. "Sir, I believe he followed emergency procedures correctly for most transactions, making them technically legal. However, some of his decisions showed poor judgment rather than criminal intent. He made risky investments that lost charity money, but that's financial incompetence, not fraud." Sir Marcus nodded grimly. "So we're prosecuting the wrong crime entirely." "It appears so, sir. The real issue isn't theft, but mismanagement of charitable funds. That's a regulatory matter, not a criminal one, unless we can prove deliberate deception." Conversation was interrupted by Victoria Sterling's arrival. She carried a briefcase full of documents that she set on the conference table with obvious satisfaction. "Gentlemen, I have the emergency documentation that Charles filed during the COVID period. Every contested transaction has proper paperwork, filed within the required timeframes, with reasonable justifications for emergency expenditure." Sir Marcus examined the documents carefully. Each form was properly completed, signed, and dated. The justifications ranged from urgent veteran support payments to emergency facility maintenance during lockdowns. None suggested criminal intent, though several showed questionable financial judgment. Miss Sterling, Sir Marcus said finally, "It appears your client followed the law correctly, even if his decisions were unwise." William studied the documents as well. "There's something else here, Mr. Blackwood." Documented concerns about several board members who were pressuring him to make specific investments. He was trying to protect charity assets from political influence. This revelation added another dimension to the case. Blackwood hadn't just been managing charity funds during an emergency. He had been navigating pressure from board members who may have had conflicts of interest. Victoria. Sterling smiled. Charles was protecting the charity from board members who wanted to invest in companies they had connections to. His poor judgment was actually ethical judgment that cost him political support. The meeting concluded with Sir Marcus agreeing to drop most charges against Blackwood, retaining only minor administrative violations that would result in regulatory sanctions rather than criminal conviction. William's intervention had not only corrected a legal interpretation, but revealed the true story behind the alleged crimes. That evening, William returned to his small flat near Westminster. The media attention had died down somewhat, but he still received occasional interview requests and messages from law students asking about his career path. His quiet life as an anonymous guard was definitely over. His phone rang. The caller ID showed his former law professor, Margaret Ashworth. "William, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to discuss something with you, of course, Professor. The Law Society has been discussing your case extensively. There's growing interest in creating a formal program for military personnel with legal training to serve in civilian legal capacities. Your intervention demonstrated the value of having legally trained soldiers who understand both military and civilian law." William listened as she outlined a proposal for a new category of military legal liaison officers who would work with civilian courts, prosecutors, and regulatory agencies to ensure proper application of complex legal frameworks involving military personnel or legislation. "William, they want you to be the pilot case for this program. It would mean promotion, specialized training, and a completely new career path that combines your military service with your legal expertise." The offer was tempting, but William had learned to consider consequences carefully. "Professor, what? About my ceremonial duties? I took an oath to serve in the Queen's Guard. You would still be serving the Crown, just in a different capacity. And frankly, your intervention in the Blackwood case has shown that sometimes the best service requires breaking with tradition when justice demands it." Over the weekend, William walked through London, reflecting on how dramatically his life had changed. He passed Buckingham Palace, where other guards stood at their posts with the same stoic dedication he had shown for 2 years. Part of him missed the simplicity of ceremonial duties, the clear boundaries between duty and conscience. But he also recognized that his courtroom intervention had revealed something important about himself. His legal training wasn't just academic knowledge, it was a tool for ensuring justice was served correctly. His military discipline wasn't just about following orders, it was about serving something larger than himself. On Monday morning, he returned to the Attorney General's office with his decision. He would accept the new position, helping to create a framework for military legal liaisons that could prevent future miscarriages of justice, while respecting both military tradition and civilian legal authority. The Blackwood case officially concluded 2 weeks later. Charles Blackwood pleaded guilty to minor administrative violations and was sentenced to community service and regulatory oversight. The charges that would have sent him to prison for fraud were dropped based on William's legal analysis and the emergency documentation Victoria Sterling had uncovered in his final statement to the court. Blackwood publicly thanked the guard, who had risked his career to ensure justice was served correctly. Judge Thornfield, who had initially been angry about William's intervention, acknowledged that the case had taught her important lessons about legal humility and the value of diverse perspectives in ensuring justice. As William left the Old Bailey for the final time in connection with the case, he reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A single decision to speak when conscience demanded it had changed not only his own life, but potentially the entire framework for how specialized. Legal knowledge was utilized in British courts. The red tunic and bearskin hat that had defined his identity for 2 years hung in his wardrobe, symbols of a phase of service that had ended but not been abandoned. He had traded ceremonial silence for active participation in justice, and while the transition had been difficult, he knew he had made the right choice. 6 months after his courtroom intervention, William stood before Parliament's Justice Committee, no longer wearing the red tunic of a ceremonial guard, but the dress uniform of a newly created position. Military Legal Liaison Officer, his single moment of conscience had evolved into something much larger than anyone could have anticipated. The committee room was packed with MPs, legal experts, and media representatives. William's case had become the catalyst for the Military Legal Services Reform Act, groundbreaking legislation that created formal channels for military personnel with legal expertise to contribute to civilian justice when appropriate. Committee Chairman Robert Ashford opened the session. Officer Hayes, your intervention in the Blackwood case 6 months ago has led to significant changes in how we handle the intersection of military knowledge and civilian law. Can you summarize what you've learned from this experience? William had prepared for this moment, but the weight of addressing Parliament still felt surreal. Sir, I've learned that justice sometimes requires individuals to step outside their assigned roles when they possess knowledge that could prevent wrongful outcomes. However, I've also learned that such interventions must be channeled through proper systems to maintain both legal integrity and institutional respect. MP Sarah Richardson leaned forward. You've been piloting the new Military Legal Liaison program for 3 months. How has it worked in practice? Ma'am, the program has allowed us to review over 40 cases where military-related legislation was potentially misapplied. In 12 cases, we identified significant legal errors that could have led to wrongful convictions or inappropriate sentences. The collaboration between military legal knowledge and civilian prosecutors has proven valuable. What William didn't mention was how challenging the transition had been personally. Moving from the structured simplicity of ceremonial duties to the complex world of legal consultation had required him to develop new skills in diplomacy, case analysis, and interagency cooperation. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Sterling, watching on Parliament TV. You've come a long way from the silent guard who changed everything. Indeed, the relationship dynamics from the original case had evolved in interesting ways. Victoria had become an unofficial advisor to the Military Legal Liaison Program, helping to train civilian lawyers on military legal frameworks. Sir Marcus Bellingham had become one of the program's strongest supporters, having seen firsthand how military legal expertise could strengthen rather than undermine prosecutorial effectiveness. Even Charles Blackwood had found redemption. His community service had involved helping other military charities improve their financial management systems. Using his painful experience to prevent similar problems elsewhere, he had written to William several times, expressing gratitude. That had evolved into mutual respect. Committee member David Patterson asked the question William had been expecting. Officer Hayes, some critics argue that your intervention set a dangerous precedent for military personnel to override civilian authority. How do you respond to that concern? William chose his words carefully. Sir, I understand that concern, and it's why the new program includes strict protocols for when and how military legal knowledge can be shared with civilian courts. The goal is never to override civilian authority, but to ensure that authority is exercised with complete and accurate legal information. The hearing continued for 2 hours, covering everything from constitutional implications to practical implementation details. When it concluded, Committee Chairman Ashford made a remarkable statement. Officer Hayes, when you spoke in that courtroom 6 months ago, you created what could have been a constitutional crisis. Instead, through careful consideration and institutional adaptation, we've created a model that other Commonwealth nations are now studying for implementation. Your conscience-driven action has strengthened rather than weakened our justice system. After the hearing, William walked through Westminster, past the familiar landmarks he had guarded as a ceremonial soldier. The contrast between his old life and new role struck him constantly. Instead of standing silently while history happened around him, he was now actively participating in shaping legal precedent. His reflection was interrupted by a familiar voice. "William." He turned to see Professor Margaret Ashworth approaching. With a broad smile, brilliant performance in there, you've become quite the advocate for institutional reform. They walked together toward the Thames, discussing the implications of the day's testimony. Professor Ashworth had been instrumental in helping William develop the theoretical framework for the Military Legal Liaison Program. "Margaret, can I ask you something? You think I made the right choice that day in court?" She stopped walking and looked at him seriously. "William, you prevented a wrongful conviction while exposing systemic problems and how we apply complex legislation. And more importantly, you showed that sometimes protecting institutions requires changing them." That evening, William returned to his flat to find an envelope that had been hand-delivered. The royal seal indicated it was from Buckingham Palace. Inside was a brief note from Sir James Whitmore. "Her Majesty wishes to see you tomorrow at 10 a.m. Wear your dress uniform?" William spent a sleepless night wondering what the Queen wanted to discuss. His intervention had ultimately reflected well on the military and the crown, but royal displeasure could end his career regardless of public approval. The next morning he arrived at Buckingham Palace wearing the dress uniform of his new position. Sir James escorted him through corridors that were familiar yet strange, the same building where he had served ceremonially, but accessed through entirely different channels. "Her Majesty has been following your progress with interest, sir," James explained as they walked. "The Military Legal Liaison Program has exceeded all expectations. Other Commonwealth nations have requested assistance in implementing similar systems." They arrived at a private sitting room where Queen Elizabeth II waited. At 96, she remained sharp and engaged, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of 7 decades on the throne. "Officer Hayes," she began without preamble, when one of my guards broke centuries of protocol to correct a judge on legal interpretation. "My advisors predicted constitutional crisis. Instead, you've created constitutional innovation. I'm curious about your perspective on this transformation." William felt the weight of addressing his sovereign directly. "Your Majesty, I acted from legal training and personal conscience, hoping to serve justice while serving the crown. The transformation has been far beyond what I could have anticipated." The Queen studied him for a moment. "You chose justice over protocol when the two conflicted. That choice has strengthened both our legal system and military tradition. The Military Legal Liaison Program exemplifies the best of both worlds: military discipline serving civilian justice." She handed him a small box. "Officer Hayes, in recognition of your service to justice and your contribution to legal reform, I'm awarding you the Member of the Royal Victorian Order. This honor recognizes exceptional personal service to the crown." William accepted the honor with profound gratitude. The award represented not just recognition of his courtroom intervention, but acknowledgement that his choice to break silence had ultimately served the crown's commitment to justice. As he left the palace, William reflected on the journey from ceremonial guard to legal reformer. The silent soldier who had stood motionless for 2 years had found his voice in a moment of conscience, and that voice had echoed through the highest levels of British government. His phone rang with a call from Colonel Hartwell. "William, I have news. The Ministry of Defense has approved expansion of the Military Legal Liaison Program. They want you to head the new training division, developing the next generation of military legal officers." The proposal meant promotion, too major and responsibility for creating the institutional framework that would outlast his individual contribution. The silent guard's moment of conscience had become a lasting reform of British justice. That afternoon, William walked past the Old Bailey, where his journey had begun. The courthouse looked the same, but his understanding of justice had been fundamentally changed by his experience there. He had learned that serving the law sometimes required challenging its application, and that true loyalty to institutions sometimes meant reforming them. As evening fell over London, William stood once more outside Buckingham Palace, but this time as a visitor rather than a guard. The soldiers at their posts maintained the same stoic silence he had once embodied, representing centuries of tradition and duty. But William now understood that tradition and innovation were not opposites. They were partners in the ongoing work of justice. His voice, raised in a moment of conscience, had not broken tradition, but had helped it evolve to meet new challenges. The silent guard had found his voice, and in doing so, it helped his country find a new way to ensure that justice and honor walked hand in hand through the corridors of power. His story had become part of the larger story of how institutions adapt and grow while maintaining their essential character. Standing in the gathering darkness, William smiled at the thought that somewhere in the future, another soldier with specialized knowledge might face a similar moment of choice between protocol and conscience, thanks to the changes his intervention had sparked. That soldier would have proper channels to ensure their knowledge served justice without destroying their career. The silent guard's legacy was not his silence, but his courage to break it when justice demanded a voice.